Professor Dillminer is going to expand on in his talk. We collectively acknowledge that Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic indigenous communities in Michigan, for indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who are forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Michigan State University more accountable to the needs of American and Indian and indigenous peoples. So I wanted to welcome, there's going to be all kinds of commemorations, I think, this Friday and Saturday that Professor Miner will expand on. So I wanted to welcome all the students and faculty, community members, staff that were able to come here. Many of us came together 18 months ago. There was a teach-in for the 3 residential colleges right in the aftermath of all the Nassar tragedies that were coming to light, and also before Spencer coming to our campus, to come together in a panel that had the same title, Building Community and Resisting Hate. And unfortunately, it seems like in the last 18 months, there's just been even more growth of white nationalism, and it's only intensified in the past 18 months. So many of you and many of us have witnessed that there's this mainstreaming of white nationalism, even in the media and tweets from the White House, and they've been matched by policies that have furthered the agenda of some white supremacists, which include tweets and chanting for Congress people to go back home, which includes banning many Muslims from Muslim-majority countries with the Muslim ban, which includes now almost banning all asylum seekers and refugees in different ways, putting people in detention centers, having 7 children, I believe, die under the government care of these children, demonization of people. And this prejudice, that we've witnessed in the rhetoric and in the policies has also kind of erupted in horrific violence that we've seen, whether it's domestic terrorism targeting synagogues in our country, African American churches, the Latinx community in the El Paso act of domestic terrorism. And we've also seen FBI statistics, kind of a huge jump in hate crimes in the last couple of years across our country. And of course, we've also witnessed this internationally, right? Even with the example of the terrorism against the 2 mosques in New Zealand. So this is an extremely serious issue that almost on a daily basis we're confronted with. Of course, white nationalism and white supremacy have been a stain on our country since its foundation, right? And this most recent resurgence of white nationalism into center stage has served to draw our attention to how these ideologies have been woven deeply into our social systems and have impacted varied minority groups to different degrees at different times, sometimes over decades, sometimes over centuries. And there are many examples that we can witness in this, whether we look at our criminal justice system, whether we're looking at race and how it affects our housing policies, which many of us read the Community One book on eviction recently, and that highlighted that, and even the land that we're starting at right now, which Professor Miner will adjust, I think, somewhat in his comments, but of course, Michigan State was ceded to the U.S. government in the Treaty of Saginaw 200 years ago this year, and there's going to be a commemoration of that this Friday and Saturday. So just really quickly, I wanted to acknowledge the co-sponsorships. So we're gathering here today, once again, to continue this conversation, to continue to learn from each other and support one another. I wanted to, again, really thank Professor Mohammed Khalil, the Director of Muslim Studies and Professor of Islamic Thought in the Religious Studies Department. He's done a tremendous job in building bridges on campus and educating on campus and beyond the campus. He actually initiated doing a continued panel, and we organized it together, and I'm so grateful for working with him on this and many other things. And I wanted to acknowledge the co-sponsorships of African and African American Studies, American Indigenous Studies, Asian Pacific American Studies, the Center for Gender in a Global Context, Chicano Latino Studies, the College of Arts and Letters, Department of Religious Studies, Peace and Justice Studies, James Madison College, and the Residential College of Arts and Humanities for their co-sponsorship and support. So I hand it to Professor Khalil for introducing our first speaker.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Aronoff. And Professor Aronoff deserves all the credit for beginning this whole Building Community Resisting Hate series. I thank her institute for setting this all up. They're recording this event. So we're going to get right to it with our first presenter. That's Dr. Salah Hassan. He is an associate professor in the Department of English, core faculty in the Muslim Studies program, and the director of Global Studies in the Arts and Humanities. Please join me in welcoming Professor Salah Hassan.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
No. No mic.
Yeah. You can hear me? You can hear me okay? Yes. Okay, so Mohammed asked me to present, I'm presenting my own views, but as a member of the, is it showing up there? How's that? Still not there? You can see it?
No.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is, it's a difficult topic. Islamophobia in the United States is pretty widespread. The first thing I want to point out is, as you all will recall, a couple of years ago, one of the first things that President Donald Trump did was sign Executive Order 13769, protecting the nation from the foreign terrorist entry into the United States, which we call the Muslim ban. Now, that went through a whole series of discussions and legal proceedings, but eventually the Supreme Court passed it, and we do live in a situation. Trump, of course, is an easy target for people who want to criticize Islamophobia because he's made lots of statements about Muslims, including Islam hates us and things like this that are just, really provocative in every way. But the Muslim ban has had a direct and immediate impact on Muslims outside of the United States and within the United States. And it's also created a sentiment that what the president says or what he tweets is a permissive discourse on Muslim minorities. Muslims represent a very small minority, religious minority, and a very diverse minority within the United States. Many of you will know that most Muslims in the United States, or the largest group of Muslims in the United States, is actually the black Muslim population. It's not the Arab or the Pakistani or the Indonesian. It's African American Muslims constitute the largest constituent of Muslims in the United States. But there are many immigrants, and so of course Muslims often get lumped into a kind of immigrant sort of discourse or anti-immigrant discourse. And so there's a double burden that Muslims are carrying when it comes to this. One is the kind of religious bigotry. It's very old, that goes back to a kind of Christian anti-Muslim sentiment in Europe and has carried forward through into the present in many ways. And we see this especially with evangelical Christians who continue in the United States to promote a hostile view of Muslims and Muslims as a continuing threat to civilization and this idea. Now, that's pretty well established, and I think most people in this room would agree that Trump's Islamophobia is very upsetting. But what happens when you see that? So when the Democrats come on board with this, and so when Ilhan Omar made her fateful statement about the Benjamins referring to the Israel lobby in the United States, she came under quite hostile attack from within her own party. she apologized, but still, like, you look at the amount of coverage of what Ilhan Omar said, and the idea that she was an anti-Semite and that Muslims are anti-Semitic, and that anti-Semitism among Muslims is this thing that, criticism of Israel is a form of anti-Semitism. What you find is that there's a kind of bipartisan sentiment around that. And Ilhan Omar became the target for that. So did Rashida Tlaib, of course, later on. Where the Democrats split with the Republicans was more recently when Trump supported the denial of entry of two Congress people, which had never happened before, denial of entry to Israel. And at that point, the Democrats sided with the two first Muslim women in the U.S. Congress. But prior to that, there was, among the leadership, Pelosi in particular, and you'll know that Pelosi has been very hostile to some of the younger women of color in the Democratic Party, has really focused on the idea that these statements by Muslim women, in particular Ilhan Omar, represent a problem. And so the coverage of that was massive. But when we contrast it with what has been said about Muslims by Republicans, similar kinds of statements. So whenever you think about AIPAC and Ilhan Omar's statement about it's all about the Benjamin, if you say, well, that's a criticism of Israel, it's not anti-Semitism, or it is anti-Semitism, as it was discussed, you'll remember there was that phrase, an anti-Semitic trope. It was an anti-Semitic trope, it's all about the Benjamin. And so this was sort of circulating a lot. But then when people started to criticize Ilhan Omar and the fact that she's a Muslim, I'm going to play this small clip. It's totally related. I'm not getting any volume off of this one? Let's see. Nope. I think it's this one. Well, you can read it. Okay, there's the tweet. You don't have to hear it. So what he says, so this is a Republican congressman who basically says Muslims are more so than most people to have great animosity towards Israel and the Jewish faith. As you have more and more Muslims in the U.S., as they gain greater and greater influence in elections, you're going to see more people like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, et cetera. And so this is Representative Mo Brooks who made this statement. Now, how is that really different from what Ilhan Omar said about the influence of pro-Israeli money, basically, in the Republican Party? It's not really that different. What he's saying, though, applies to Muslims. There was absolutely no coverage of it. I mean, it got tweeted out by people who were like criticizing the Republican Party for making a blanket statement about Muslims and their influence on the Democratic Party. And so he goes on to say that the Democratic Party is going to become the party of anti-Semites, the party of like Israel bashers and this kind of thing. He doesn't put it in those words, I'm kind of exaggerating a little bit, but it's like this idea that he can say what he wants and generalize about Muslims in the same kind of way that maybe Ilhan Omar mistakenly or exaggeratingly expressed the influence of Israel lobby on the Republican Party. But this is more directly targeting these particular individuals as if they are taking over the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And so what we're seeing is this kind of double standard. You can't say things in public about certain groups of people, but you can say them about Muslims and get away with it. And this is particularly toxic at a moment when we do see a lot of violence in the region where it's acceptable, drones killing Yemeni people or Syrians dying. It's as if the lives and the values and the faith of others is dismissed, while the lives, faith, and values of people in the United States, whether they be Jewish, African American, or even Latino, have a certain kind of value. And so I would suggest that, like, we're living in a moment where there's things that you can say about Muslims and their disposability. The idea that when Muslims die, it's okay. But if it were to happen to another minority group, whether it be a religious or racial minority group, you'll never have that kind of bipartisan coming together where it's like it's okay for an African American. I mean, you can see this with Black Lives Matter and the protests against that, where Democrats are largely supportive of that. And similar, we saw this in the critique of Ilhan Omar, where Democrats and Republicans come together in criticizing her as an anti-Semite. Thank you.
So I just want to quickly introduce Professor Dylan Miner. He's the Director of American Indian Indigenous Studies and Associate Professor at the Residential College of Arts and Humanities at Michigan State University. He's also an artist. He sits on the board of the Michigan Indian Education Council and is a founding member of Just Seeds Artists Collective.
Thank you. And I'm glad that Yael read the land acknowledgement, but I'm going to begin by reading a full version. So if anyone's been to the American Indian and Indigenous Studies webpage, we have 3 different versions of the land acknowledgement. A very short one, the one that Yael read, Professor Aronoff read, as well as this longer one that I'm going to read. And I think that it's important because it puts some of the contemporary period into context and some of the ways that what we're understanding in this moment is actually situated in a much longer history of ongoing violence and land expropriation on Indigenous people. If you're interested, as Yael said, we are commemorating, not celebrating, but commemorating 200 years of the Treaty of Saginaw this Friday with over 30 native speakers, 3 different performers, contemporary Anishinaabe foods at the MSU College of Law all day, and there'll be an evening event on Friday at 6 p.m. in a place that some call People's Park, but on a map of campus from 1857 when classes were held the first day is indicated as an Indian encampment. So Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi people. The university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize that settler and indigenous signatories understood the terms of the treaties in starkly different terms. According to a map within the university archive, Anishinaabe maintained a, quote, Indian encampment south of the Red Cedar River when classes were held at the university, then known as Michigan Agricultural College, on May 13, 1857. As one of the first land-grant colleges, Michigan State University is a beneficiary of land allotted through the passing of the Morrill Act in 1862. The university finds pride in calling itself the nation's pioneer land-grant college, a term we, and this is written in the collective we from the faculty of the program, a term that we find highly problematic and recommend that it no longer be used. The Morrill Act, which enabled the land-grant system, was passed in the same year as both the Homestead Act, which granted 160 acres to individual settlers who quote-unquote improved and farmed land in the West, and the largest mass hanging in the history of the United States, the state-sanctioned murder of 38 Dakota. And this would have happened in Mankato, Minnesota. So we understand that there is an indelible relationship between the creation of the land-grant institution, the simultaneous and ongoing expropriation of indigenous land, and the governmentally coordinated genocide against indigenous people. By recognizing the ways that settler colonial institutions benefit from these interconnected histories, we work to hold the university accountable. In American Indian and Indigenous Studies, we recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, as well as other indigenous peoples and historic tribes in Michigan, across Turtle Island and throughout the Fourth World. We acknowledge the real ways that the state of Michigan, Michigan State University, and residents of this land have benefited from the forced and systematic removal of Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples from Michigan, particularly during the Indian removal period of the 19th century. We affirm and acknowledge the Burt Lake Band, who were literally burned from their houses in 1900 in this particular land, which is in kind of the middle northern part of the Lower Peninsula, is now property owned by the University of Michigan. We also acknowledge the Métis community, this would have been my community, who were forced from their homes on Wotagini-Minis or Drummond Island when the border was drawn between the US and Canada. Likewise, we recognize that parts of what is now Michigan include land within the traditional homelands of the Miami, Meskwaki, Sauk, Kickapoo, Menominee, and other indigenous nations. we collectively understand that offering land acknowledgements or land recognition, such as this, do not absolve settler colonial privilege or diminish colonial structures of violence at either the individual or the institutional level. We recognize that land acknowledgements must be preceded and followed with ongoing and unwavering commitments to American Indian and Indigenous communities. In AIIS, we push Michigan State University to recruit, retain, and support American Indian and Indigenous students, faculty, and staff. Moreover, we affirm that Michigan State University must support Indigenous communities and nations in Michigan, as well as throughout Turtle Island and across the fourth or Indigenous world. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic communities here in Michigan, for Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who were forcibly removed from their homeland. We affirm Indigenous sovereignty and hold Michigan State University accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. So one of the things that when we wrote this, we wanted to make sure is that there was, if people have been kind of traveling and are in kind of woke spaces, you'll know that people are more and more frequently saying land acknowledgements, but oftentimes they're totally disconnected from any relationships to tribal communities or the uplifting of Native peoples in general. And so when this was written, we wanted to make sure that there's a relationship between these affirmations and these statements and making sure they actually had repercussions for Native people. Which leads me to about 3 minutes to say some other things from my own notes here. So I say this because the history of this nation emerges from a history of genocide and violence, right? And it is very American to take indigenous lands and establish racist laws, blood quantum laws, for who can and who cannot access indigenous rights. So for instance, my community was on Drummond Island, forced into Ontario, and we petitioned, this would have been the British government at the time, and it's archived in Indian Affairs as half-breed Indians praying for president. There was a petition to get land and annuities, and it was never ignored. Or it was ignored, and therefore our rights were never ceded. White nationalism is a violence and a form of violence that we must confront. However, the history of redlining and school segregation in this very state must also be addressed. The history of violence against indigenous peoples and land expropriation, for instance, the Burt Lake burnout, where Native peoples were literally burned off their lands, and then settler folks moved in, and then now some of that land is in the hands of the University of Michigan. And it's easy for many of us to abhor certain kinds of ideas and very outwardly violent and racist action. But it's often those sorts of actions and ideologies that become enshrined in law and popular practice that we must also be the most concerned with. So to not draw parallels between our contemporary politicians and previous racist, fascist, right-wing regimes is to not understand how power works. Self-identified white nationalism is a threat, but so too are other forms of American nationalism and patriotism. It is from within our current system. So it's within the system that, for instance, the previous administration deported more undocumented migrants than any other president, right? So it's within this structure. When people combat, on the other hand, when people combat anti-migrant sentiment by stating that we're all immigrants, they're in fact denying the very structure of the emergence of this nation today, right? And so they're also ignoring the fact that the majority of migrants coming up from Latin America are of indigenous and mestizo ancestry, another layer to the story. Let me just end on 2 points related to hate against indigenous communities. One is the ongoing attempts to undermine the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is basically a law put in place to combat the centuries-old abductions and taking away of Native children from Native families. And there are actually attempts in the court to move this out of law. And the other is that 4% of hate crimes are committed against Native peoples, while only 2% of the population are Native. So disproportionate number of hate crimes against Native peoples. And this doesn't even take into account the very real ways that anti-sovereignty movement, groups like Citizens for Equal Rights, use various legislations to try to actually take away tribal power within the country. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer. Our next presenter is Dr. Stephanie Nouwen. Dr. Nouwen is co-director of academic programs at the Center for Gender in Global Context and Associate Professor at the Department of Sociology. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nouwen.
Thank you, everyone. I want to first start out by thanking Professor Miner and all the AIS faculty who wrote that statement. So I had come to MSU really, I'm sorry, I did that myself. I came to MSU really enamored with the whole land grant ethos, and then a couple of weeks ago, read the statement and realized the problematic nature of that. So I'm thinking differently about what service means, which is really what the land grant, what was important to me about the land grant mission was the service to all the people here in Michigan and globally. And I'm divorcing that from the very problematic way in which this land was granted, right? It was taken from other people and given to this university. So I really want to thank you for that. I am both a gender scholar working at the Center for Gender and Global Context, or GenCen for short, and I'm also a refugee scholar. And I asked them, like, what should I talk about? Which of these? And I was sort of given broad powers to say whatever I wanted. And I decided, being a white woman on this panel, maybe this would be a great time for me to call out and call in other white women and talk about the complicity of white women in what seems like a very, and in fact, am I too close? I'm so sorry. Is that better? I don't want to overwhelm the recording. So I was just came from an event that the GenCen had for our graduate students who are enrolled in our specializations, and somebody asked me, explain to me what is going on with these white women that vote for Trump. Help me understand this, right? So I think about it in the context of my work in the GenCen, but also as a refugee scholar. There really is a conflation. I see this intersection, a weird intersection about what people support. And I'll start with Roy Moore. Do you all remember Roy Moore? Okay. So this very problematic figure from Alabama, arguably a pedophile rapist who had a majority of support of women, white women specifically, like black women. 99-point-something% of black women voted for the other guy. But the majority of white women voted for this man who was, I think, any reasonable person would say he's at least a serial sexual harasser and probably a rapist of children, right? Because there is not minor women, right? So a woman under the age of 18 is not a woman; she's a child. But when you broke down the numbers, it got really interesting. So about 70% of white women who identified either as atheist or not religious actually did not vote for Roy Moore. His support came from white women. His support came predominantly from Christian white women, and especially evangelical white women. And so as a refugee scholar, I'm looking at some of the support for things like building a wall at the US-Mexico border. And Pew has done a bunch of studies on this, and this was one of the questions, should we build a wall? And again, the majority of white people and the majority of white women support building a wall on the US-Mexico border, which I think is a good proxy for lack of support for immigrants, right? And xenophobia at the very least. But if you break that down by religion, you see something really interesting. That it's a majority of white Protestants, slight majority of white Catholics, and an overwhelming majority, 75% roundabouts, of white evangelicals are the ones who support building the wall. If you look at Protestants, and other Christians who are Black, who are Latinx, they're vastly against building a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. And you see the same pattern for support for refugees. Pew asked the question, do we have a responsibility to help refugees? This is a great proxy, as you know, Professor Hassan, for support for refugees generally, and anti-Islamophobia specifically. And the vast majority of white evangelicals think we don't have any responsibility. Again, overwhelming, like 75%, think we don't have a responsibility to support refugees. And slight majority of white Protestants and white Catholics think we should not support refugees. And if you look at white people who don't identify with the religion, they're kind of pretty much the opposite. And I thought this was interesting as somebody who studies the involvement of religious people in refugee support, refugee resettlement, that generally speaking, there are a lot of things we can disagree about on Christian doctrine, right? People are fighting about all sorts of things. The one thing that seems to be universal is welcoming the stranger. I would love, if anybody can find a single passage in the New Testament that says anything anti-immigrant, even vaguely, please bring it to my attention, because I've been looking and I can't find it. So this is sort of interesting to me. And one of the things I'm exploring is this marriage, if you excuse the term, of whiteness and Christianity that has really fed into both white supremacy generally and a lack of support for anything that might support people of color. It's fed into Islamophobia, it's fed into anti-Semitism, and it's deeply connected to patriarchy. So white women have this choice. Do I go with my own gender liberation and buck this whole white supremacy system, or do I invest myself in whiteness and vote for Trump? And 55% of white women in the last election decided to vote for Trump. I will say that there is probably a very large proportion of white women who chose not to vote at all. Some of them showed up at the Women's March in January 2017, right? Like, there were actually a lot of women there who were like, oh, I didn't think this was going to happen, and drove all the way to DC to march. So I don't know what's going to happen in 2020. The Gen-Sen is organizing a big conference, and I'm about women's political power, and I'm really hoping that it's a happy conference and not we're all depressed and on some sort of antidepressants. But I'm running out of time, so I just want to say that I think there is something very deeply problematic with the decision that white women have made to connect themselves to their whiteness. That whiteness has gotten them something that gender equality they feel has not. And that's what really needs to be dug out and interrogated. So if you are, like me, a white woman, I think talking to your people and our people and calling them in on this is really, really important. This could shift what's happening in this country. And I hope that's what we see in the coming years, and especially next year and next election. Thank you.
Dr. Satara Tobani. She's an assistant professor of cultural anthropology in the residential college of arts and humanities, and she's affiliated with Asian Pacific American Studies and Asian Studies and Muslim Studies. So,
all my bases covered. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to begin by thanking Drs. Khalil and Arnott for organizing this and inviting us to this panel. What I want to do is begin with the premise that in order to think through white nationalism or white supremacy, we really have to start with whiteness. And so what I want to do this evening is just throw out a few points on whiteness that I want to contribute to the conversation. and leave them there, and I'm happy to pick them up in the discussion afterwards. So the first point about whiteness that I really want to make is that yes, of course, whiteness is a shifting category. The ways in which it has been defined, the people who have been entitled to access it has changed historically, and it needs to be placed in that historical context. However, whiteness is also institutionalized. Whether we think of it in terms of Cheryl Harris's terms of whiteness as property that is then protected by law, or in the terms of Carol Anderson, who talks about the invisible white rage that operates in the courtrooms and the legislatures, we need to look at what our institutions are doing in order to ground and sustain this thing called whiteness. This is especially important for us sitting in this university setting, and here the history that Dr. Miner brought our attention to is really important. We need to ask ourselves, how is white supremacy and institutional whiteness shaping who gets to speak and in which terms, even when the topic of the conversation is race? And so that's one thing that we really need to start to think about, is how is whiteness grounded in these institutions so that even as a category, it changes according to historical context, there is still this institutional continuity to it. The second point that I want to make is that whiteness and white supremacy is bigger than the individual, right? That it is the systemic institutionalized entity. However, it also manifests in and deeply shapes each of our individual experiences. Okay? And so here I really want to raise a point which has been hinted at already, that when we're talking about white supremacy, it's not just the big spectacles, the big performances of white supremacy or white nationalism. It's not just the young men in khaki shorts carrying tiki torches, but it's the fact that the president's approval ratings are as high as they are right now. So again, whiteness as larger than the individual, yet impacting the most minute details of each of our individual lives and experiences. And then the final point, I'm breezing right through this because I want to get to the discussion. The final point that I want to make is whiteness is relational. Okay? It's this marker in this relationship of power in which we are all placed. And in this way, whiteness is seductive, and this becomes a difficult point to start to think through. It's seductive in its promise of respectability, its promise of meritocracy, its promise of economic development. And if we think of whiteness as relational, we have to look at the roles that people in our communities, and here I'm speaking to racialized communities, I'm speaking to my community, the roles that some people in our community play in this very relationship to sustain and uphold and support this project of whiteness that really underpins the whole project of white supremacy. So we have to call on our communities of color to engage with indigenous struggles for sovereignty and to really recognize what does it mean for our attempts to access the rights of citizenship and our claims to status when we are defined as immigrant communities. What does that mean in the context of settler colonialism? What is the relationship that we are staking for ourselves in relation to these other transformational projects? It also means refusing anti-Black, anti-immigrant, and Islamophobic racisms. And again, that's something where we see these kinds of racisms offering a kind of easy access to that respectability that whiteness promises but never fully delivers. And this is one of the really, again, difficult things to think about in terms of racialized communities, is that desperate search for respectability, that desperate search for acceptance that is always going to end up in failure and yet still requires sustaining these kinds of racisms. And so one thing that I look at in my work in relation to the South Asian community is this very surprising and disturbing relationship that develops between different nationalist projects. So I'm thinking specifically of religious nationalisms grounded in the politics of India that are then articulated not as overlapping with the politics of white supremacy here in the US, but actually finding legitimacy through and therefore actually validating in turn these projects, these very exclusionary projects of white supremacy. So we do need to think of whiteness in these terms, I think, in order to understand how white nationalism is operating in our current moment and really look at what each of our relationships is to that larger project.
Our next presenter is Dr. Estrella Torres. Dr. Torres is an associate professor in the Residential College in the Arts and Humanities, co-director of the Indigenous Youth Empowerment Program, core faculty in the Chicano Latino Studies Program, core faculty in American Indian and Indigenous Studies, and co-chair of Women of Color Initiatives. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Torres.
I'd also like to thank everyone for being here this evening to discuss this very light topic. This is a great evening discussion. I'm going to go to yoga after this. So I want to just throw out a couple of things. So a couple highlights of the last 2 months. In early August, over 600 workers were arrested in a massive raid in Mississippi, separating hundreds of parents from their children. In El Paso, 22 people were murdered by a white nationalist whose manifesto included, quote unquote, ridding Texas of the Hispanic invasion, end quote. Trump announces that his administration will allow children detained with their families to be detained indefinitely. The Supreme Court upholds Trump's asylum ban to move forward. The ban effectively bars asylum seekers from filing their claim in the U.S. Instead, they have to file it in a, quote, safe third country through which they traveled en route to the U.S. Never mind that no such country exists. I also want to call out the names of Roxana Hernandez from Honduras and Johanna Medina Leon from El Salvador, 2 trans women who were killed in detention centers. We've had a busy 2 months. I want to take note, this is not the first that Mexican Americans or Mexicans or people from Central and South America have died at the border. In the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, the U.S. sent Texas Rangers and Army soldiers to the border and erected an electrically charged barbed wire fence to keep immigrants out. Thousands of Mexican Americans were lynched, burned alive, and brutally murdered by local ranchers, vigilante mobs, and Texas Rangers and Army soldiers. We then were followed by the 1950s and Eisenhower's Operation Wetback, who deported as many as 1.3 million immigrants. I'm just going to jump forward to Barack Obama, who deported 3 million Mexican and Latin American immigrants. This is not something new for Latino or Latinx community. Every time there's some type of recession, economic downturn, we're the first to be prosecuted. We're the first to say that we are stealing people's jobs. I want to share a personal story of myself, my own, the way that I'm from Michigan. I always have to say that because people ask where I'm from, where my family's from, where my parents are from. Yes, of Mexican descent, of Mexican heritage, but my family has always been on the Texas, New Mexico land, regardless of whose nation owned it. This is the land that we call. I'm here because my parents were migrant farm workers. I was a farm worker. My parents and families, we've always been migratory. We've always moved. We've not necessarily found or stayed within a particular border state or nation state and been blocked by borders. My family has dealt with when in our small town when there was an economic downturn, we dealt with folks, and I shared the story at the teach-in, that when there was a particular point in our small town of Cairo, Michigan, that I had a certain group of so-called classmates decide to put swastikas and white power, write these things in spray paint on my house and on my car. When the police came to my home, they found that it was gang related. My parents had no recourse. The students, the classmates had no types of consequences or repercussions. But what I found, and I guess I really just want to focus on the solidarity, because for me, we know the impact of white nationalism. But I want to talk about solidarity. And in that moment, what I saw were folks who didn't necessarily, in the small farming town, what I saw was folks weren't okay with that. We did have folks, our neighbors, come who were white, who were kind of ashamed of what had happened to our house, because we were their neighbors, and my family had lived there since the 60s, so we'd been there for 2 generations. So it wasn't okay for that. But I also want to say that spaces like this are incredibly important. It's important to talk about coalition building. It's important to talk about solidarity, because we can get lost in 2 months of Trump and white nationalism, supremacy. It's not for us to forget about those things, but we can get so overwhelmed and so steeped in all the negativity and the violence and anger that we forget that we can reach across the table to one another and share these stories and talk about how can we work together. Because so far, the reason white nationalism and white supremacy has been able to take the stage because it has is because we've been working within our own communities and focusing, and it's important to focus on what's going on in your community, but it's also important to look across and see what other communities are doing and what they're facing. And to see how can we uplift one another, how can we work with one another, how can we share resources with one another, how can we make sure that we don't forget these histories. So with that, I want to share a couple things. I want to share the story I want to talk about folks who are doing this wonderful work of coalition building, Dignity for Detained Immigrants Act, the National Network for Immigrants and Refugee Rights, Angry Tias and Abuelas of the Rio Grande. And this is just a group of women who are tias and abuelas, and if you don't speak Spanish, it's aunties and grandmas, who literally are angry about what's happening and are working across. They're not just working with the Latinx community, where they're working with all communities in the Rio Grande and helping support them. The Black Alliance for Just Immigration. These are folks who are working across communities. They're building solidarity. They're doing coalitional work. And I think it's important for us to think about how can we do that work. And spaces like these are incredibly important. It's great to have these spaces here, but how can we continue this work moving forward? How can we make sure that we're learning from one another? What are the tools that we can share? Because white supremacy isn't going to go away overnight. It's only going to go away when we work together and there's consistent, persistent shutting down. Every time somebody says something, every time something happens, how do we stand up for one another and how do we shut those acts down?
Thank you for also pointing to organizations that people can turn to now. And one of the things, I don't know if it's the case that I've heard, is just donating to also groups that will get bail for people so they can get out of detention, because sometimes they can get out of detention but don't have the money to do so. But yeah.
Black Lives Matter. There's a group, there was I think it was one of the Michigan chapters in Black Lives Matter did work around that to help with some of the folks who were detained.
Okay, so thank you. I'm going to quickly introduce Professor Emeritus Ken Walzer. He taught here at James Madison College for 43 years, and he directed the Jewish Studies program for 10 years. He taught a class here on anti-Semitism for 43 years, and on the Holocaust, and is continuing to write a lot about contemporary anti-Semitism and also the aspects of contemporary white nationalism that affect anti-Semitism. So.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. I want to make a distinction before I begin, and then I want to make 4 points and elaborate them. Distinction is a reaction to what I've heard by speakers before me. I think we've tended to use white supremacy, racism, white nationalism as interchangeable, as almost synonyms for one another. And I have a different take on that. My take is that white nationalism is an ideological movement, right? It includes white supremacy, it includes racism, but it's a particular formation, 20th century, now 21st century, that has real consequences, and I'll try and point them out. When I try and think about this movement, and in particular when I think about the mass casualties, the mass actions that have happened in Charleston, in El Paso, in Squirrel Hill, and Poe, and I think about them all together, I ask myself, what is this movement about, and what animates it to do these kinds of things? And given my background, I come to a number of quick conclusions, which I want to share with you. Number one, and this may not be immediately obvious to Americans, at the core of white nationalism is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, by that I mean a conspiracy theory about an evil satanic force in the world that is making things bad, and white nationalism must stand against that. Some of you may have wondered why at the rally in Charlottesville, the Unite the Right rally, people carried signs, "Jews will not replace us," right? This is an answer to that question. Because at the core of white nationalism is a theory, an understanding of the world in which Jews are manipulating things to displace the white race, the white Christian race. So at the core of white nationalism, I would like you to think about the importance of anti-Semitism. Secondly, I would like you to think about white nationalism as something that lives in history and has a history, and also changes in history, incorporates into itself new elements in accord with the time in which it's active. And I want you to think about white nationalism as something that has roots in American history, as many of the previous speakers have tried to imply, deep roots, and I want to name them. But I also want you to think about it as an increasingly global movement, which is also influenced by identitarian movements in Europe, which are white nationalism. We're up against something that's growing and changing. Thirdly, I want to make the point that white nationalists, when they think about the danger to the white race, they're eliminationists in their orientation to what to do action-wise. They are oriented to violence. The violence that they commit should not surprise us. It's part and parcel of the movement. It's happened, we've seen it, and it's going to happen again. And if we want to deal with white nationalism, we have to expect and quarantine and defend ourselves against such violence. And finally, what kinds of initiatives do we need, following Australia, in coalition and in alliance with one another, do we need to think about to defeat, to isolate, and to quarantine this white nationalism? And I'll get back to that at the end. My first point I mentioned is that the theoretical core of white nationalism is anti-Semitism. We can see what white nationalists think by reading their flyers, by reading their literature, by hearing their speakers speak. We can know what's going on in their head. Many of them put flyers on our campuses so we can pick them up. And when they do put such flyers on our campus, we see that they are racist, we see that they are anti-immigrant, we see that they're Islamophobic, but we also see that at the core of what they think is that there's a conspiracy of the Jews who are moving everything, who are satanic force making all the bad things that they think are bad happen. So white men, are you sick and tired of the Jews destroying your country through mass immigration and degeneracy? The Jews are the active force there in that view that animates them. Beware the international Jew. Those of us who studied the 30s and 40s have seen some of this language and some of these images before. When the right was united and got together, they marched and they said, the Jews will not replace us. And remarkably, those of us who watched the television and listened for commentators to point out what that meant were usually disappointed. They didn't pick it up. They didn't pick up that central core of it. It's a conspiracy theory of the world. And those who are taken up in it are are willing to think the worst about eliminating all Jews and eliminating the other sources of danger, black immigrants and so forth, if they get the chance. So Squirrel Hill, the Tree of Life Synagogue, a white nationalist went in there on a Sabbath morning and shot 11 people. It's the worst anti-Semitic incident in all of American history. This happened in our time. And the guy went in there, he was upset because Jewish institutions were helping refugees and immigrants to come to America. And so he blamed it on the Jews. And he went in there, he told the police who arrested him afterwards, desiring to kill all Jews. Where are the roots for this kind of view of the world? Well, those of us who study American history have encountered the American First Movement before, in the 30s. The Charles Lindbergh effort to keep us out of World War II. Those of us from Michigan, if we know our history, have encountered Henry Ford and Father Coughlin and the Ku Klux Klan, and Gerald L.K. Smith, the Silver Shirts. And those of us who teach immigration history or study immigration history will have encountered Madison Grant in his important book, Passing of the Great Race, in which he was the first person to lay out this idea of a replacement, a substitution, race suicide, people losing their place in the sun because new immigrants were coming in. But white nationalism is also changing, and it's updating. And so it's not just Henry Ford recycled. It's also globalizing, and it's subject to global currents. It's identitarian. Some of you may not have heard that term, but that's a term about social movements on the right in Europe, which seek to create situations where people of the same ethnic descent dominate a territory and a culture. They believe they're being displaced by Islamic immigrants, and they seek to shut out and exclude such people from their Europe. And what ties all of that together, and this may also be new to some people, replacement theory. There's a theorist in France, his name is Camus, but he's not that Camus, who argues that white civilization is not replacing itself, it's rather being overrun by others, and we're getting a white genocide by substitution, right? And that's a view of the world which heavily places the blame on women. Because women are working, because women are feminists, we're not reproducing ourselves enough, and there's a kind of gender component to that which is increasingly written about. Third, I mentioned white nationalism embraces violence. Those guys came to Charlottesville heavily armed. That's the image you should have in your head about white nationalism. It is capable of that. Luckily, they killed only one person that time. But they killed more in El Paso. And they killed more, the guy who shot up the church in Charleston, the AME church, was also a white nationalist, Dylan Roof. So they're capable of all these things, and these events are all tied together, all committed by white nationalists believing in the teachings of white nationalism. So to close, what can we do? This is the list I came up with today. I think we need to do things like we're doing right now, exposing white nationalism, teaching, speak-outs. We have to make use of teachable moments, whether they're ceremonies about commemorations or so forth. Secondly, we need to become articulate about and counter replacement theory, counter hate based on that notion. Third, we need to honor the victims, memorialize them. Fourth, we need to defend, restate, and always highlight democratic values, what we believe in, that all people are deserving of equal mutual respect. Fifth, we need to bring an enabling administration to its ignominious end. That little sign on the PowerPoint was the actual first sign that the Trump administration developed for the upcoming content. And they took the logo from a white nationalist site. It's now deep sixth. It's not. They're not using it because somebody pointed out to them that it was a white nationalist sign. If we can take back our state, we need to broaden federal and state surveillance, infiltrate this movement, track it, and recognize it as an ongoing danger. The FBI is not doing that now. It should be doing that. We need to monitor the global linkages and influences because it's becoming global. And related to this, we need to enact and implement effective gun reform legislation so these people find it hard to get their hands on the kinds of guns that do the damage that we've seen. Thanks.
Thank you. Last but certainly not least is Dr. Jeffrey C. Ray. Dr. Ray is a professor of English, William J. Beale Outstanding Faculty, Paul Varg Alum Faculty, and a filmmaker. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ray.
Hi, folks. I'm just going to put this up, and then I'm going to go back over here. How are you this evening?
Well,
I'm having flashbacks to grade school when the W's were always last. I used to beg my teacher, let's do it in reverse order. And she would say, no, Jeff Bray, no. Ken Walter was my first boss at MSU 20 years ago. He's still the best boss I've ever had. He should really be running this place. So thank you, Ken. I really want to jump right to the discussion because I was making notes of what Ken said, and I was like, I disagree with my old boss here, and I agree with him here, and Australia and all that stuff. But I like stories. I'm a filmmaker. I love black people, and I tell stories about black people, and you're going to hear two today. The first one is called Building Me a Home. The picture on my left is my late father-in-law, Mr. Flynn Hamilton. He passed away this spring at the age of 93. At 16 or 17, he left Alabama to work in the tire factories in Akron, Ohio. After World War II service in Europe, he returned to factory work in Akron and started a family. He was a master builder as well. This was his other job. And just a little side note, the concept of a side gig or a side hustle ain't new. It has always been an economic imperative for black folks. In the early 1960s, Mr. Hamilton went to lenders seeking financing for the home that he and Rachel Hamilton would build and raise their family in. He wrote out his meticulous drawings and explained cost and needs before the inevitable no came. One story he often told was of one lender who looked at his plans and responded, "Boy, that house is bigger than my house." That was a solid no. And let's skip over the fact that Mr. Hamilton was not a boy at the time, but indeed a grown-ass black man. Financing was eventually found, but at a much, much higher interest rate. That is perhaps a later point of discussion on the implications of white nationalism on black generational wealth. The brick ranch was built, still beautiful on Chippewa Avenue on the east side of Akron. It was built by a collective of family, friends, tradespeople on weekends and during days off from factory jobs requiring long summer days of construction. Ultimately, the Hamiltons building their home was indeed a success story, but don't call it a classic American success story. America gets no credit in this. This was a black family and black community success that happened in spite of deeply rooted white nationalist American foundations. It is not mere white nationalist thinking alone or racist individuals, but rather foundational white nationalist culture, custom, and law continually enacted as policy. Let me repeat, continually enacted as policy that presented and presents obstacles to black people, people of color, and all kinds of other folk. Multiply the obstacles of the Hamiltons building their homes by millions of black men, women, and families over generations. There were, of course, many success. Again, not because of, but in spite of America. However, the hard truth is that there were many failures because white nationalism is and was a core American value, bedrock national policy, which was and is, as we are finding out, agile and shape-shifting. The obstacles it presents are real and continually have marginalized or frankly crushed millions of black lives and aspirations in centuries past up to this very day. Second story, Ella May goes to college. That woman on the right, thank you. That woman on the right is my mother, Ella May. She died in 2000 at the age of 62. This is her high school graduation picture in 1956. Her future fully ahead of her. 12 years later, in 1968, in a small town in Ohio, she was a new widow, a 28-year-old with 3 small children, her husband, my father, having been killed by gun violence. In the aftermath, she decided to go to college. And many people, even family, asked, why are you doing that? How are you going to do that? And these were legitimate questions. If nothing else, black folks often understand the reality, the true difficulty of challenging an embedded white racial and gender order. She was a young black woman in 1968 with children. Nothing in American society was made for or encouraging of her to go to college. There was no GI Bill-like opportunity for her. The obstacles for her, same as for Mr. Hamilton, came from ingrained white nationalist policies presented as the natural order. They were designed to limit black people at best and to crush black people at worst. That is real. That is actual. Still, young Ella May did it anyway. She went to college, finished a BA, and ended up going on to a PhD. Again, hers is a story of success, but not a credit to America. When she started college, our family moved in with her parents and my grandparents. During summer, she sent us, her boys, off to my father's family in Tennessee. She made the long hour-plus drive from Medina, Ohio to Akron University every day for 4 years. And years later, she told me that was often with tears in her face, just with the difficulty of the task. Again, Ella May's triumph is one of extended family and black community in the face of white nationalist culture, systems, and policy, not the least designed for or encouraging of black survival or success. A great lesson from my mother's stories and millions of other black people's is this. In order to survive and prosper to an extent, Ella May had to be a superwoman. The history and pervasiveness of American white nationalist policy forces black people to be exceptional. There is a saying I've heard all my life: you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. Again, black people, if nothing else, understand American realities. But the counter to the black exceptionalism requirement is that whites, particularly white men, are consistently allowed to be average at best or simply mediocre in greater American societies. Such examples abound in current American life. Think of our previous president and our current president. The white in white nationalism and white supremacy is there for a reason. There are other things to discuss about generational implications and the true psychic and health cost of living under foundational, consistent, and persistent white nationalism. But I'll end on these last two notes. In the 1970 film, The Landlord, which is a great underrated film, a liberal white landlord becomes romantically involved with a black tenant. In one of the final scenes, he and the woman are in the hospital about to have a baby. When the nurse asks what race they would like listed on the birth certificate, the mother, the black woman, speaks up quickly saying, "List him as white. I want him to grow up casual, like his father." That's supposed to be funny, y'all. Richard Spencer, The Proud Boys, Races in Polo Shirts, Chants of Jews Will Not Replace Us, and sentiments of good people on both sides are all disturbing and need to be confronted. But collective community actions must address the impact of historic, significant, and continuing policies of white nationalism. From obstacles overcome by Flint Hamilton building a home, to those confronted by LMA becoming Dr. LMA, to contemporary shootings of Latinx communities, synagogues, mosques, Sikh temples, and black churches, white nationalist culture is not resurgent. I'm going to be saying that all night. It is not new, it is not resurgent, but has always been very much alive and deeply rooted in the American fabric, sanctioned by law, culture, and policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we open the floor for questions, I would like to invite my colleague in the Department of Religious Studies, Dr. Morgan Shipley, to say a very brief word.
Thank you all very much. First, thank you to the panelists. That was an amazing hour. I feel honored to have learned with you all, so I just want to thank you. In an effort to keep this dialogue ongoing, but also to encourage our students on campus to get more involved in building community and resisting hate, the Religious Exploration Club, which is the student group that their Religious Studies Department sponsors, along with the MSU Museum, along with the MSU Library, and various other programs, are going to be sponsoring a sticker contest for this fall. It's going to be a student-designed sticker. The winner of it will actually produce the sticker in the spring to release and sell around Martin Luther King Day. The proceeds will go to the MSU Food Bank, and it'll also coincide with a social media campaign we'll be doing in the spring as a way to try to bring greater community. We'll ask students to take social media pictures of the stickers, hashtag it with State of Love, and we're going to do various kind of pop-up events around campus, all around sharing various discourses, mostly connected to religion, but also just broader issues of community.
Welcome, lots of questions and discussion. Yeah.
Well, these are a lot of somewhat related issues, but maybe they're not all due to the same cause. So I can only put my question in terms of some of the causes. It seems to me that we're at an exceptional time. That is, if we go back 10 and 20 years, we'll find all aspects of racism and of hatred. But though those may be similar, I feel that we're in a particular moment of crisis now. And I don't think it's simply because Trump was elected. He's in fact the symptom, not the cause of these hatred. So in trying to understand it, at least one part of it, it strikes me, might be understood as proxy wars. That is, if you think of 9/11, that's the American way of centering all this hatred and violence of today. 9/11 wasn't the beginning. Only Americans think of it as the beginning. Prior to 9/11, there were issues that led to the upsurge of violence that 9/11 stimulated. There was violence in the Middle East, and so maybe one way to say it is that the chickens came home to roost. And that's I want to put this in terms of a question. Instead of us, and this will take us actually to the final comments that Jeff, but particularly Ken, were saying as well. What's happened outside us, outside our borders, affect what happens within our borders. And in that regard, I'm thinking of the violence in the Middle East, for example, is not separate from the Islamic phobic hatred which we have in this country. That being said, the populism which is abroad can't be separate from the populist hatreds that have been stimulated in this country. And that complicates things because Netanyahu finds his allies in Hungary, where we have the greatest populist and anti-Semitic leaders as well. That's so. I want to put this in terms of a question. To what extent can we think that what's happening in this country, in fact, has resonances in events that are outside of our borders that we can no longer keep separate from what we're having in this country?
Would anyone like to answer that? Go ahead.
I agree with you, Ken. We've lived through a transformation in our place in the world. We have easy terms that describe it: globalization. We've been on multiple military adventures since the time I was in high school, and in Vietnam, in Asia, and now in the Middle East. The world has changed so much, partly connected with globalization, that people who could expect a cushy life, right? Even people who worked in Akron on the black side of town could expect a pretty successful life, steady employment, maybe a boat, certainly a car.
Jumping right here.
Okay. It's gone. There was a wonderful art exhibit in Chicago this past week about Lordstown in Ohio, and about how it's all closing down. It's all gone. Those people have nowhere to go. That's the moment we're in. And those people are a ripe constituency for this kind of hatred, and it's very scary. I have grandchildren. I think about this all the time. But it's surely connected with our place in the wider world. I want to agree with Ken.
Well, my best former boss ever. I think that I just keep seeing this push-pull, and I see it somewhat on this panel, and I see it in this question, in that there are things that have happened recently that, if anything, have brought the chickens home to roost for white people. And that's what's different. And that's what is being labeled as urgent. Because if you're talking about black folks, if you're talking about indigenous folks, this has been, this terrorism, this broad and very normal sense of white nationalism has been there all along. And the thing that upsets me is that we can build coalition, and we should build coalition, but we got to build that joker correctly. We got to understand that this has been long and persistent with some folks, and such that other folks didn't even have to take a look at it. But the chickens have come home to roost to white folks, and particularly white working class folks. And so to me, that's the difference. But don't label that urgent. You can call it new, but don't label it urgent, because it's been happening to black folks and Latin folks and Native folks as foundational to this country. So that's the difference that I see.
My comment, I'm going to actually direct to you. Sorry, I can't remember your name. But one of the things when I argue or talk with people when it comes to immigration and stuff is when I'm talking to white people, I simply say, when you show me your visa or permit that the Native Americans gave you when you came over to this country, then we can talk about immigrants. Until you do that, you're just as well an immigrant, because the only people who can claim this country are the Native Americans. And so when they start talking about that, I don't understand why that doesn't get the scope that it should. Because all the white men that are feeling displaced and saying they're not going to be replaced When they came in here, they came violently and took over land that didn't belong to them.
Yeah, that's part of the, yes, that's part of the structure of settler colonial violence and genocide, is that kind of in this continent, right, the idea was to both kind of take indigenous lands and with, you know, the establishment of blood quantum logics to actually kind of basically make native peoples no longer existent. And then if you look at some of the narratives, particularly in places, you know, there's two settler colleagues of mine who did a book on Black Hawk and looked at the way that in Iowa, in Wisconsin, and other places, the story of Black Hawk is taken up by white folks. And so when you look at kind of what happens with the peopling, the taking of land, and then the taking of those stories and those histories, I mean, those are part and parcel. So the way that it happens for most white folks, is that they don't even think Native peoples are here. And if they are, particularly in certain territories, there's actually an and that's when you look at where are the locations for these organizations which are violently against tribal sovereignties. And they're in states where there's a much more kind of, white folks see Native peoples on a more day-to-day basis. You know, I think there's a relationship too with the ongoing presence of you know, football teams who use racist logos out of the capital of this nation state. A team in Cleveland which has calls themselves the Indians and, you know, has a racist logo. I mean, there's also a relationship with those going on that, you know, the kind of the telling of this narrative is one that, you know, this country likes to tell. And that's one of the things that I say is that there's this map that supposedly documents campus on the first day of class, but it was actually made in the 19th century, and my guess it's actually this narrative which white folks wanted to say about this campus is that when they started teaching classes here, there was still an Indian encampment here. So it's part of the actual, you know, taking over the land and taking over those stories, if that makes any sense.
Hey, I am Jen Fry. I'm a PhD student in geography here. And so I just want to say, I don't remember your name, ma'am. You spoke about Mexican immigration. I myself was actually undocumented my first 10 years from the scary country of Canada. This is what you bring over here, I know. And so I got my citizenship through the Ronald Reagan amnesty law. You've been here X amount of years, you get your citizenship. I also grew up 5 minutes from the Mexican border from Arizona, so completely understand a lot of the stuff you're talking about. When we're talking about whiteness, it's always interesting because it's never talked about on a big scale within in a university. So my question to y'all is, what is Michigan State doing to talk about whiteness with the administration? Because we know that diversity and inclusion sessions love to talk about people of color. They love to talk about Native people. They'll talk about every day, all the time. But when it comes to whiteness, that never happens. So we know it needs to start from the top and go down. So what is Michigan State itself doing to talk about whiteness with the president, whichever one it is right now, with administration, with athletic department, with faculty, deans, chairs, to start that trickle down? Because we know white male students will not start acknowledging stuff until the bigger, richer people start doing that. So what is Michigan State in itself doing to create that downward trajectory?
Us looking at each other like, do you know what's happening, should indicate where that conversation is going. Like, I think for them the conversation really is talking about diversity and inclusion, and so what that means is for people of color, for BIPOC folks, it's reliving our traumas and talking about the things that we're enduring, so that sort of for the fetishization of others. I think that's kind of where we're at. I mean, unless somebody knows anything different. No?
No, you know, what drives me a little nutty is that inclusion and diversity is completely divorced of any power analysis, right? So it's all about different people coming together and talking about our differences, but no interrogation that some of us have more power than others. And it's, from what I can tell, it's pretty absent above the dean level. I don't really know what's happening at the dean level. And then, you know, it's like folks like us talking to each other all the time about this, but I don't know how much of that is being heard up. But this isn't really in their defense. A lot of stuff is not going up, right? So it's everything. It's a point of frustration, for sure.
I think if I can just kind of add to your excellent question, one of the things about a fetishizing focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion is, again, upholding this idea of respectability. So it's not just about bringing in diverse bodies into the space, but how, by bringing in those diverse bodies into that space, are you still upholding these ideas of a respectable 21st century institution, which again is just allowing these issues to continue. So the question is, absolutely what is MSU doing? But I think the larger question is, what can the university actually do? What larger kinds of transformational changes do we have to make in order to engage in some kind of dialogue that is actually meaningful, that isn't caught up in this kind of performance?
Okay, hello. My name is Michael. So I have always been very fascinated with history in general, and fairly recently, when I was I'd say my freshman year of high school, I was obsessed with knowing my family history. So I researched it and more into it, and I realized about all of the different types of stories that can be told, both good and bad, both beautiful and sad. So it's just, I feel like with our generation now, at least for the younger generation, I feel like we were always told, and I can't speak for everyone, but I'm speaking from my own personal experience, that we were always told that we're the generation that can fix everything. We're the generation, oh, don't worry, everything will be fine. And my question to you is, how would you want us to go about doing those sorts of changes and within our own unique environment when we travel out beyond college, beyond just simply interacting with people in general? Because our generation, I feel like we've always been put on this pressure to redo the damage that had been done in previous generations. But how would you want us to really react to something like that when we personally haven't really, we've experienced it. I've experienced racism in my own time, but not to the extent of which you guys are expressing it. So how would you want people like me and my generation to really go forth and send forth that message of equality and to demolish white nationalism with care and, without doing anything wrong in the process?
Well, I think the last part, I would question your last part there, without doing anything wrong in the process.
Well, in general, I mean,
Well, okay.
Because, we come to this panel to, learn about these sorts of different, whoopsies, sorry. But we come to this panel to learn about these different, these different stories, these awesome stories about, women's rights, all these different ethnicity stories, or just all these different stories. But the question I've always remained is, how do we do that? Because my generation, we get the message, we understand the history, we have the technology, but what would you want us to do? If you could, I guess a better question would be, if you were in I guess younger, and you were in our generation, what would you do to fix these changes? Because I hear these stories.
You're messing up, I'm gonna tell you right now.
Well, I'm just very curious. Of course, I'm very clumsy all the time, so, I'm just showing the flaws and all, so. But my question is, in general, what would you have us do? Regardless of your color or ethnicity or even age, what would you have us do in order to spread forth this message to demolish white nationalism?
Can I just offer, this is a pretty broad offering, but I mean, generally, this panel is wonderful, and things like this of being in community are wonderful, because I'm sitting here and learning things, particular things that I didn't know, or perspectives that I didn't consider, those kinds of things. But I do think that ultimately you have to take all of that and really very much do it your own way in your generation. And I think of my daughter was in DC at a Black Lives Matter protest, and Al Sharpton, how can I say this in a nice way? Al Sharpton and his generation were on the stage, and they wouldn't give up the stage. And so the Black Lives Matter young folks, including my daughter, I mean, she called us right after that, and she was just so upset because she said those old, did she cuss her? Is my wife here? Did she cuss or not? But those old folks would not leave the stage. And that just resonates with me because there's like a time to, I mean, you all have to say to us, thanks, great job, scoot over, step off. Here we go. So it's this acknowledgement of kind of historic leadership, you know, very broad, but also a matter of like, you're gonna do things in your way that make someone in my generation mad and good. Just good. Do it.
Here, then.
Hi. So thank you all for your words. I appreciate everything you've shared. So my question, before I pose my question, so I grew up in Palestine, and I've noticed and witnessed white supremacy in the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And this is through like Palestinian-Israeli relations, like the Israeli occupation, the military in Palestine, as well as people of color in Israel. So I see it as a common theme, militarism. And I guess my question is, what is the relationship between U.S. white supremacy, militarism, and racism? Yeah, I'm gonna say that's my question.
Is anyone answering that? Because I'd be happy to answer that. I don't know if you want to, Ken, because you're one of the panelists, and I'm just going to moderate. The gentleman who's Palestinian asked what the relationship is. Tell me if I'm phrasing this correctly, between Israeli white supremacism and the occupation of, no, I'm getting this wrong.
No, what's the relationship?
U.S. militarism and
white supremacy and racism.
And white supremacy and racism. I don't know if you'd like. Do you want? I can do it like. So, sorry, I just want to clarify. So, are you saying what is the relationship between white supremacy and militarism in the U.S., not racism and white supremacy in Israel, or what?
Well,
I just want to clarify what you.
Yeah. No, I see. I guess the relationship between militarism in Israel and the U.S. is very clear, right? The $10 million a day, the contracts for training, things like that. And I'm wondering, and so that relationship is clear to me. But I'm wondering what the relationship between like the military-industrial complex is with racism and white supremacy. Is that?
Okay, yeah, that's a large question, and others may want to answer that as well. But certainly, I mean, one has been talked about. In this case, you could talk about how white nationalism may influence different aspects of U.S. militarism everywhere and foreign policies and so forth. On Israel-Palestine in particular, that's my kind of area of research and teaching, as well as some others. So certainly, there are problems, of course, moral problems, political problems with Israeli occupation of the West Bank. And it's my sense in my classes that any self-determination for peoples includes self-determination for Palestinians and the need for a Palestinian state. And I think there are probably differences in terms of tactics, even amongst us in the panel, as to what the best ways to do that are, and which may include for some changes in foreign aid and other things, and for others, like myself, working more on urgently pursuing peace negotiations. And there's really elections tomorrow in Israel, and hoping for a leadership that will provide more urgent change there, as well as in the U.S. administration that will. And then we could talk about Palestinian leadership. But I think there are differences in terms of tactics of getting there on this particular issue. I don't know if anyone else.
Yeah, I just to think about it in terms of a kind of signal figure, I would say Kaepernick is like a place to go to think about that relationship, because of the way that his protest became a real site for an assertion of nationalism in opposition to him taking the knee, and then the way that particular kind of protest was racialized, especially in connection with black athletes, locally even. And there can be no doubt that the way that the U.S. military has been able to capture the entertainment business in a certain sense, like through athletics, like the flyovers, and the way that the national anthem becomes a moment of patriotic expression in a very militaristic way. At the high school football games here, when the marching band plays at halftime, they often bring out a veteran and they honor that veteran. You see this at local high school football games. I mean, so it's become a crucial part of, and these veterans are mostly veterans of Middle East wars, Iraq, primarily. So Afghanistan. But so there is a way that relationship, I think, has become discursively sacred. You cannot say something critical of the U.S. military. I mean, it's like a sacred figure within, and so Kaepernick's protest is one that inflames not just the NFL, but the U.S. administration, and because of that, and represents to me a very important expression of that, and I would say that that's connected to Ken Harrow's question about the relationship between what happens outside and what happens inside. And I would say that what's happening with guns in this country is related to that. Is that in every generation, like war generation in the United States, when you have the training of young men, and now young men and women, to kill, there's no doubt that when those positions are brought home, that they express themselves in civil society. I mean, it's just, you'd see it after World War I in relationship to certain so-called race riots. You see it in the 1960s with, certain kinds of violent crime in the 60s, and related to Vietnam. I mean, in every generation where we can identify World War II, Vietnam, and then the Middle East wars, there's this way that gun violence in the U.S. amplifies, and the production of guns is, not stopping, so it's actually increasing. So, yeah.
Can just jump on very quickly to that point. Really, I'm just echoing it, but that is an incredibly tight relationship. And not only is it a tight relationship, but it's a mutually constitutive relationship in that each one of them builds on and supports the other. We only need to look at examples like the images that came out of Abu Ghraib. We only need to look at the language that was used by the white supremacists who went out to shoot South Asians and other racialized individuals after 9/11, after the election of Donald Trump. And the continuation of the same kind of language, the same kind of Islamophobic tropes that are used, that's central to the U.S. military's approach to war as much as it is central to white supremacist terrorism here.
Ding. Microphone check, all right. I mean, the United States is a military project. I think you can't think of it any other way. Whether it's the kind of thinking of manifest destiny or the three acts that I mentioned earlier, the Moral Act, the Homestead Act, and the hanging of the Dakota 38. All of those are linked together in ways that we can't think of the United States not as a military project, and therefore as a colonial project. Much of the global instability has to do with, migrations north from Central America has to do with, anti-communist and other military incursions in the 1980s. When we think of all of these other things, there's a clear relationship there.
I guess I was trying to formulate in the context of this question about militarism, a question about climate, and I can't get to it. I can't really formulate it. But one of the things that also has been going around in my mind as we've all talked is if you look in Europe and you look in the United States, there's a way that scholarly rhetoric has just been adopted by white nationalisms. All the work that we've done on identity categories, all the work that we've done on masculinity has been soaked up and appropriated by people that are using our own scholarly apparatus against us. And I was just curious if anyone had any comments about whether that means we need to think more clearly as scholars about the language that we use and how we construct the kinds of arguments that we make, or if there are thoughts about how to work against that appropriation of post-colonial rhetoric or white identity politics that would serve more progressive ends.
Johanna, are you talking about postmodernism and sort of the social construction of reality?
That and second wave feminism. Second wave feminism and the emphasis on the individual is a huge fueler of identitarian politics.
Yeah. So referring to the second wave feminist movement and this focus on, say, liberal feminist politics, right, that are very individualistic versus women of color feminism and other kinds of feminism that critiqued capitalist. I mean, I think building off of what Professor Miner said, I think the U.S. is both a militaristic project and a capitalist project, right? That the violence that appropriated this land and enacted genocide against people who lived here also brought slave labor here. And I would say, I think yes, I think we need to think strategically about the kind of language you're using. And I don't know, like, okay, so I'm sort of down on, this is a bad thing to say as a university professor, but I'm kind of frustrated with scholarliness generally, because I don't know where